Good afternoon and welcome to this installment of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars program, Wilson Then and Now. Thank you very much for being here. I'm Trygve Throntveit. I serve as Global Fellow for History and Public Policy here at the Wilson Center, and I also serve as Director of Strategic Partnership at the Minnesota Humanities Center in St. Paul in the Twin Cities, where I reside. The Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars aims to unite the world of ideas to the world of policy by supporting preeminent scholarship and linking that scholarship to issues of concern to officials in Washington. Congress established the center in 1968 as the official national memorial to President Wilson. Unlike the physical monuments in the nation's capital, it is a living memorial whose work and scholarship commemorates, quote, the ideals and concerns of Woodrow Wilson. As both a distinguished scholar and national leader, President Wilson felt strongly that the scholar and the policymaker were engaged in a common enterprise. Today, the center takes seriously his views on the need to bridge the gap between the world of ideas and the world of policy, bringing them into creative contact, enriching the work of both, and enabling each to learn from the other. This series, Wilson Then and Now, is our effort to make Wilson and his period more central to that creative contact between ideas and practice in national and global affairs. In a critical way and in an inclusive way, we seek to highlight work on Wilson, his time, and his legacy that offers explicit or implicit lessons for contemporary or enduring problems of public and international life. Since February of this year, we have been reminded of just how contemporary one of those enduring problems remains, the problem of international peace and justice and how to maintain them. Some see the international response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine as a surprising success. The United States and Europe have largely agreed on supporting the Ukrainians, strangling the Russian economy, and taking a bit of hard economic medicine themselves to do it. But others might interpret these efforts as a success only in comparison to the general failure of international organization for global peace, justice, and human flourishing over the past 75 years. Some are asking, for instance, when, if not in this flagrantly illegal and unbelievably deadly instance, is the United Nations ever going to intervene with force against an aggressor? Others ask, what about all the conflicts in the Middle East, the Far East, and the Global South, recent and current, to which the powers now supporting Ukraine have effectively turned blind eyes? And still others, why can we spend 40 or 80 or 100 or 120 billion dollars to coordinate a response to a war that has killed perhaps 10 or 15,000 Ukrainians, but allow inequitable vaccine access to lead to 600,000 unnecessary deaths across the world? We are not here to blame particular global actors for these tragic scenarios. Speaking for myself, I want to suggest that much of the blame lies in the poor design of and consequent lack of trust and investment in the suite of international institutions anchored by the United Nations. Again, speaking for myself, I will further suggest that much of the blame for the poor design and low investment falls on past US policymakers who based their decisions on narrowly nationalist criteria and later bad history, rather than on a sound assessment of the nation's and the world's security needs. Whether these suggestions complement or challenge those of our two guests, we'll have to find out. Before we get to that, however, let me introduce our two guests. Tiziana Stella is a historian of US foreign policy, international order, and world organization, currently serving as director of the Strite Council for a Union of Democracies. A former Fulbright scholar, she has held research and teaching positions in Italy, the United States, Russia, and Germany, including, but not limited to, the University of Pavia, the University of Washington, Moscow State University, and the University of Tübingen. Dr. Stella also served as co-organizer for the Council for a Community of Democracies in preparation for the Warsaw 2000 conference at which the Community of Democracies was established. She is currently working on an intellectual biography of Clarence Strite, focusing on the impact of world federalist thinking on US foreign policy planning in the 20th century, provisionally titled World Organization Through Democracy, Clarence Strite and the Genesis of the Present World Order. Thank you, Tiziana, for being here. Campbell Craig is Professor of International Relations at Cardiff University and is joining us from Wales. So thank you for making the time. Dr. Campbell focuses on the problem of nuclear weapons from a theoretical and historical perspective, with special attention to the Cold War. Before joining the Cardiff faculty, he was professor at Aberystwyth University, which I probably mispronounced, and at Southampton University, and held senior visiting fellowships at Yale, the Norwegian Nobel Institute, the European University Institute, and Bristol University. His latest book, co-authored with Fred Loggeval and out from Harvard University Press in its second edition last year, is America's Cold War. Thank you for being here, Craig. I promise we'll hear from our two guests shortly. Before that, two things. First, audience members are welcome to submit questions at any time during this program via one of two channels: the Q&A function on this website, or the email address historyandpublicpolicy, one word, @wilsoncenter.org. Second, before we hear from Drs. Stella and Craig, I'm going to say a few words about the emergence of the League of Nations, the first effort to organize states under a constitutional framework for the prevention of war and achievement of shared goals. I don't typically take a speaking role in this series, but for this topic, it seemed necessary to have a scholar of the League's US origins, and I was the one whose schedule I knew best. Still, I'll try to be brief and make just a few points, all of which challenge, in my view, conventional wisdom on Wilson and the League. To give you a preview, in sum, I argue that the League of Nations, as constituted in the covenant that Wilson largely wrote, was far better designed than, say, the United Nations in terms of efficacious action against aggression. That the League also had the advantage over the UN in the democratic and thus legitimating character of its structure and processes, and that US participation in such a league was not a pipe dream, but rather the expectation of a large majority of the American people at the end of World War I. Regarding the design of the League. Despite the assumptions of many, Wilson never sought or promised a world rearranged into ethnically self-determined, territorially independent polities based on ethnic composition. Careful reading of his public and private statements from May of 1916 through the last bitter days of the League fight, including his famous 14 Points address, show that rather than a world designed according to the principle of self-determination, Wilson envisioned a world of self-governing polities, free and united through what he called a common council, or deliberative democratic discourse and decision-making. In the cases of certain long persecuted groups, notably the Poles, but they're certainly not the only ones, he considered political independence crucial for world peace. In other cases, Allied resistance and Wilson's own deep prejudices made full self-government a distant goal for many peoples. Yet in Wilson's mind, all arrangements were subject to revision by the League, which over time, he hoped, could correct the injustices sure to plague any settlement of so complex a conflict. I can't here explain all the ways that the League reflected this vision. I've written multiple articles on the topic, and it takes up much of a chapter in my book. But I want to take the question of voting as one example, an example that places the relative democracy of the League in sharp contrast to the oligarchical character of the UN. It's little known that Wilson consistently pushed for majority decision-making in both the Executive Council and full assembly of the League, against British and French insistence on unanimity, which is to say, national vetoes over international initiatives. Our current Security Council, in which a scofflaw or aggressor nation like Russia, or in so many cases in the past, the United States, can block the world from even discussing an appropriate response to its actions, demonstrates the importance of this core commitment of Wilson. Indeed, after nationalists in the US Senate forced Wilson to push for a clause explicitly identifying unanimity, and thus vetoes, as the general rule, Wilson helped secure means to circumvent it. These permitted any member to request investigation of situations, quote, dangerous to the peace of the world, and most importantly, excluded interested parties, even permanent council members like the United States, from voting on recommendations. This was no perfect democracy, and it would be foolish to argue that it was. But it was not the bald formalization of imperialism that some scholars insist, and it was a heck of a lot more democratic than the United Nations, in my opinion. Indeed, Wilson's nationalist critics in the United States portrayed it as far too democratic and far too likely to put the conclusions of its deliberating government members into action. Even after securing a reaffirmation of the Monroe Doctrine and a means of withdrawal at the insistence of a powerful minority of senators, those same senators and their political allies portrayed the League's Article 10, which pledged to maintain the territorial integrity of members against aggression, as placing American forces entirely at the mercy of a world democracy, or binding them to quash any and all domestic revolts against oppressive rule. To correct these impressions, Wilson embarked on a grueling speaking tour, explaining that the covenant did not make Americans the foot soldiers of European empires, but did demand a commitment to resist unilateral force as a tool of political change. Meanwhile, Senate nationalists, led by Henry Cabot Lodge, demanded multiple reservations explicitly limiting American obligations to participate in such resistance. These were coldly calculated to reduce Wilson's options to two: accept what he deemed dishonorable and ineffective terms of membership, or refuse them and exchange the stately role of compromiser for the tawdry role of defiant partisan. At this crucial moment, Wilson suffered a massive paralytic stroke. A healthy Wilson might, we will never know, but might have eventually accepted even highly qualified League membership, hoping the relationship would evolve with the League itself. But after his stroke, Wilson proved incapable of such strategic thought. Before the final Senate vote in March 1920, he ignored the inclinations of most Senate Democrats and ordered them to reject membership on the nationalists' terms. Many defied him. Just 7 more would have secured America's place in the League. Now, the fact that nearly 2/3 of senators supported some form of League membership tells us nothing about the American people. And in a democracy, at least at that point in our history, what the majority of people think does affect the efficacy and sticking power of policies. So how do we tell if League membership would have mattered? Was it important enough to enough Americans to allow for meaningful international cooperation, even under the shadow of the Lodge reservations? I think it was. Between the spring of 1919 and the spring of 1920, an astounding number and range of citizens expressed support for League membership. It was endorsed by the Federal Council of Churches, representing 150,000 Protestant congregations and perhaps 30 million people. They were joined by the Union of American Hebrew Congregations and the National Catholic War Council, an umbrella group representing both the Catholic hierarchy and laity. The General Federation of Women's Clubs, National Council of Women, Women's Christian Temperance Union, and the National American Women's Suffrage Association all resolved repeatedly in favor of membership. The leaders of the Red Cross and YMCA also supported League membership at a time when the Red Cross alone claimed over 30 million members, or around 1 in 4 Americans. What about the economic interests? Well, the American Federation of Labor overwhelmingly approved the covenant at its 1919 and 1920 conventions. Nearly 200 agricultural groups, representing a huge majority of America's 12 million farmers, collectively endorsed membership in May 1919. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce distributed pro-League literature, and after the second Senate vote, the American Bankers Association not only reaffirmed support for U.S. membership, but sent a delegation to the International Chamber of Commerce in Paris to confer on how to bring it about. Support for membership emerged even in very conservative circles. The head of the militaristic American Rights League insisted that Teddy Roosevelt would have wanted it. And in September 1920, in the heat of that year's national election, the American Legion's national commander gave a powerful endorsement, urging war's first-hand witnesses, its veterans, to join the pursuit of world peace. So why does this story of a failed experiment matter? I'll suggest very quickly just 3 reasons. First, America's absence crippled an organization expressly designed to include all great powers. It meant the immediate obsolescence of the League's economic boycott powers due to fears America would scoop up all the foregone trade. Meanwhile, American membership was the key to Britain and France reconciling their divergent post-war plans for Germany's future: economic rehabilitation versus industrial and military castration. That outcome depended in large part on a three-way defense pact that was null and void without US adherence to the Versailles Treaty. In short, US membership could have facilitated more coordinated responses to conflicts in the 1920s, better preparing the international community to tackle the apocalyptic crises of the 1930s, and perhaps preventing the worst from arising. Second, whether or not a Second World War would have come, a record of constructive cooperation between America and Europe would still have made a difference by providing plausible normative and institutional alternatives to the more domineering model of global leadership America adopted after 1945. In fact, several State Department officials and influential consultants actively pushed for a Security Council much like the one Wilson designed, without a veto, through early 1944, a period embracing several moments when the Soviets' discomfort with such a design was nothing compared to their desperation for US food, money, and materiel. It was not until the last year or so of his presidency that FDR decisively joined the day's nationalists in concluding that the League's majoritarian principles had somehow made it less effective than a consensus principle would do, while also, contradictorily, seeking to insulate the United States from any challenge to its absolute freedom of action and the unrivaled economic and military power it had gained as a result of the Second World War. Third and finally, this century-old, never-run experiment in global governance should prompt us to reassess today's prevailing thought and practice. Consider it. Woodrow Wilson, prone to racist thinking, guilty himself of imperialist incursions during his administration, facing a world in which nearly every rival power had exhausted itself, this man eschewed global dominance at the end of World War I for a bigger and, in his view, more honorable prize. Why? Because for all his blind spots, Wilson saw that no person or group of people is an island, and any freedoms enjoyed by one depend ultimately on the forbearance of others. And consider this: the American people themselves, notoriously suspicious of the old world and fiercely proud of their political independence, these people came in the majority to approve their nation's membership in the community of power that Wilson envisioned. These weren't saints, these people. They were simply thinking people, capable of reflecting on experience and changing their minds. Today, when it is tempting for scholars, policymakers, and citizens alike to yield to the inertia of domestic and international life, I think we should remind ourselves of the alternative traditions, practices, and ideals that history reveals. And to help us do that with reference to a later period in history, I'm going to now ask Tiziana to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Trygve, for this. Some of the points that you raised, especially the wide support across the spectrum of the public, is something that is very visible also in the experience of World War II. And so you made my work easier by bringing that up, because changing names, it will be a very similar situation where you see that there is this wide support that is cut across traditional dividing lines. You also brought up the issue of the public and polls. And similarly, in World War II, we see that the American public, in fact, was not against such measures. This can be measured in different ways. There are polls that one can look at, and also there is the even more evident realization that these measures and the measures to create world organization that could work and that could eliminate international anarchy was something that was supported also by a big chunk of the isolationist spectrum. And I think in that regard, that perhaps Roosevelt missed an opportunity to bring together American society on a different ground. So apart from that, what I would like to say is that today we are at the most dangerous moment in human history. And we really do not have any international organization, international structure that can deal with any of the crises that we have. And even worse, we are asked to deal with this crisis from the perspective of strategic competition, which is a failing perspective from the point of view of democracy, and also in many respects. But also because we are asked to do that in an era when the day of force is over. And so doing so would just continue the illusion that we can achieve security by such measures. So I'm asked to cover the period that goes from the end of World War I to the end of World War II. And I think it is such a rich period that perhaps the best way to approach it is to look at patterns and what these patterns are telling us about what we can do today, what we might do today, at what point in this compounded crisis we're at this specific moment. So in terms of the history of these ideas, I think that when we're talking about the debate on world organization, we can streamline it into a debate in favor or against removing international anarchy. At the end of the day, that is the issue where people disagree. And this was the main issue where people disagreed throughout the first 6 decades of the 20th century. This was a very important point to Americans, and this is why it became so crucial for American society at that point in time, the discussion on world organization. It was not just a discussion where elites or governments were involved, but this was a discussion that saw public movements mobilize in favor of a transformed international system. It was very important because Americans knew that once their democracy had to engage with the rest of the world run by power politics, that created a problem for Americans' democracy. So how to create a situation where engagement was possible without entanglement. And the only way to do so was by creating structures that would replicate similar mechanism to that of federation. So for short, I would refer to two alternatives: the alternative of federation, it's a broad category, and the alternative of cooperation. By cooperation, I mean nation states trying to cooperate on the basis of intergovernmental agreements without removing and derogating any national sovereignty and without removing international anarchy. Having said so, I think that we should look at what are patterns that do emerge in the two world wars. On both occasions, before the wars erupted, there were proposals for international federations that Americans put forward, not just Americans, but I'm looking at the history of the United States. And they were meant precisely to prevent the situation of anarchy in which a war could have occurred. In World War I, we have the resolution, the Bartlett-Bennett resolution that passed unanimously both in Congress, and that was not implemented. There was a war at the point where Americans were asked to participate in the war. The big point of discussion and the peak of interest became the idea that to participate by transforming the international system. And in 1917, that idea was supported by a large number of people, including Walter Lippmann and Norman Angell, that were working with Wilson. Wilson had a lot of discussions on this basis with them. It was supported even from Europe. Einstein was one of the supporters of such idea. Even the League to Enforce Peace at that point contemplated the idea that by creating union of democracies that was not led by unanimity principle, it was the best chance to transform the world and the post-war order. And these were just some of the supporters of this idea. But so we see at the moment in which American participates in the war, and that there is a peak of interest in ideas of federation. In both wars, there are vast popular movements in support of these proposals. There is the League to Enforce Peace, and then there will be the Federal Union movement. And these movements were supported by a variety of political views and social, economic. They were very inclusive movements. And then in both world wars, the ending world organization is a universal union of sovereign states, which does not eliminate international anarchy. And so by looking at this pattern, I think we do understand that twice there was a certain degree of support for a different international system that did not materialize at the end of the war. And now I'm gonna look a little bit more into what happened in World War II, and then go back to the interwar period, because I think that is by looking at that period that we really can understand the degree of the crisis and the magnitude of the crisis that we are facing today, and how the structures that we're dealing with are totally inadequate. And in reality, they are putting democracy on the losing side. So in World War II, we come, before the war, there is a wide consensus that some derogation of national sovereignty is necessary if international organization has to work. This was not something that was just proposed by federalists, by some fringe movement. There was an agreement among intellectuals and among anybody that was pay attention to what was going on in the world, that without such measure, nothing would have changed. And that is why the proposal of Kronenstrait at the time was the main proposal for removing international anarchy had such huge success. And it was this prevailing theme in terms of discussion of foreign policy and the options of the American people for the first 2 years of the war. So why was it so successful? Because it did represent the hope and the analysis of this generation, a generation that had entered World War I on the promise that peace, the promise of peace and democracy. For that generation, that promise and the fact that it was not realized was a vivid motivation at the moment of World War II, and that is why there was this big mobilization and the book as such success. So it did reflect at what point American society was in terms of commitment to a certain degree of change. And that was not something that the Roosevelt administration appreciated enough. However, again, when America entered World War II, there is again a peak of support that is very visible in polls, and also in the fact that there is public request for President Wilson, supported by very prominent figures, so including Owen Roberts. There was a Supreme Court Justice, including Aaron Ickes. There was Secretary of the Interior, David Clark, was advisor to Stimson. Wendell Willkie supported it. Friedrich Schumann, a realist, supported it. And many, many figures supported the idea that if the United States were to enter the war, they were had to enter upon the condition that a union would be created of federal character, and that should be the precondition for the American people to agree to enter the war. And there was a big spike of support for that. In fact, the American people were asked, what would you like, in which way would you like the United States to participate? The option that had the least support was an option in which America and led by America and Britain, which was the option that was supported by American elite, and the option that had the most support was entering through a union of democracies. Of course, this did not happen, but nevertheless, these ideas penetrated public discourse very deeply, to the point that when there was discussion on what kind of international organizations and world organization should be put together at the end of the war, planners considered only two options. The two options were federation and cooperation. And there are State Department documents and records showing that they understood that there was very strong pressure, not just among the public, but also within the State Department toward that solution. It was not adopted for a variety of reasons, one of which was the fear of isolationism, which was to a great degree a fear that had been constructed and misunderstood in the meaning of why some Americans did not want to enter the war. And also the idea that the American people would have been against. Polls since indicate that the American people might not have been against, because by the end of the war, we have a clear evidence that the American people wanted to participate in international organizations on the basis of equality, and they were willing to derogate some national sovereignty. At that point, the idea was an international police force, but there was no opposition. There was a majority in favor of that. So the degree to which these ideas and framework penetrated discourse at that point is also visible in the fact that, one, the American government wanted support for the United Nations. The metaphor of the Constitution was used. And that was that was a language that had been used by Federalists, because the idea was we move from league to federation, from articles of federation to a federation. So that would be the constitutions. And it was understood by the public in that way. And it had to be defended by the government when, in the form that when, I think there were some Senate hearings in which Stettinius was asked, well, what about federal union? He said, well, yes, this is the Constitution, but it is not federal, not in the sense of a federal union. Now, let me look at my notes. Yeah, yes, I want to arch back to one more thing. When there were the negotiations for the United Nations, ideas of federation were also brought up at the time, and they're visible in the compromises that the Article 108 and 109 for revision of the Charter that was pushed by Harold Stassen, who was a Federalist, and that hoped that that would then move United Nations more toward a federalist structure. And despite the fact that a lot of the time Senator Vandenberg has been understood, as the main enemy of all this, approach of international organization, I think that some of the criticism that he and John Foster Dulles brought up replicated very much ideas of Norman Angel and also Lippmann, and the concern that a system that does not allow change is a system that is unjust and is a system that can only be changed by means of war, of the threat of war. And so their concern was that the system had to be flexible and that there was some inherent injustice in that structure. Now, going back to the interwar, because I think that is, yeah. So what happened in the interwar? We have the League of Nations. The League of Nations was created without removing international anarchy. The League cannot really prevent the world financial crisis and the security crisis that follow. And at that point, we see a degeneration of democracy, and we see democracies becoming totalitarian regimes, other democracies are degenerating and backsliding, similarly to what is happening today. Because when the international structure cannot guarantee security, then these trends do occur. And one of the things that at that point was raised particularly by realists and in the terms of the realist critique to the League was that the opposite to totalitarian regime was not internationalism, but it was democratic federation. At that internationalism was just replicating a system where nation states, by remaining the main protagonist of decisions at the international level, were actually creating an environment that was not in favor of democracy, and that the competitive edge of democracies, the ability to unite by using democratic methods and by creating political union, which is something that autocracies cannot do. And I think in this, there is a very important lesson in terms of what we're doing today and the failure that we are setting ourselves to do in terms, we can just look today at the G7 meeting and the claims and the goals of the G7 meeting of climate action and the total impossibility, not just because of the magnitude of the problem, but also because of the structures that are bringing democracies together. And the last thing I would like to say in terms that I think is also important for what's happening today and understanding the magnitude of the crisis that we are facing is that at that moment, the idea that democracy could really spread at the national level if an international organization were set in place without removing anarchy, really that was the hope also of the 18th century federalists like Mazzini, the idea that first democracy spreads and then democracies can actually live together in peace was tested, and the two stages, the understanding was the two stages had to be reverted. The first democracies had to consolidate their power in a federation, and that would create an international environment without anarchy that would be in favor of democracy. The last thing is that we did have two attempts at trying world organization in the 20th century, both failed, and we do not have a chance to have another war and the third attempt. So the only measure today is to prevent that such war was to occur because of the existential risks that are connected at this moment with conflict. And I think that is a very important consideration as we move along in thinking about options for restructuring international structures that at this point are not on the table. Thank you.
Thank you, Tiziana. And speaking of existential threats and what international organization has to do with them, I'd like to turn it over to Campbell for his remarks. Thanks again for being here.
Thank you, Trygve. And I'll remind you that Campbell indeed is the first name, because you called me. It happens all the time. So
did I call you Dr. Campbell earlier?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
It's perfectly fine.
I'm used to people having some trouble with my name actually as well. So I really do apologize for that.
It's okay. So I'm going to be speaking about the post-war era, and I'm going to be focusing almost all of my time really on the first couple of years after the Second World War, because I argue that after those first couple of years, the possibility of serious international cooperation and organization was no longer in any way feasible. The die was cast after 1946, and that a serious international organization and cooperation was after that year impossible. I'll start the story with Roosevelt, who was hoping very much in the last year or two of the war to see his plan for a serious security community, a system of collective security, twinned with the United Nations, verging United Nations, achieve these kinds of things we've been talking about. And for Roosevelt, the lesson that he had taken from Wilson's failure was that the United States needed not to implore the nations of Europe and other states to accept his ideas, as he did in 1919 and 1920, but rather to force them, to give them no choice, and that the United States could emerge from the Second World War as such a preponderant power that it would simply impose this new system of collective security, as well as other forms of international reform, upon the rest of the world, who would have no choice but to accept them. This is how Roosevelt believed he could succeed where Wilson had failed. But of course, by late 1944 and early 1945, Roosevelt discovered that there was a gigantic obstacle to this idea, and that obstacle was called the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union, under Stalin in late 1944 and early 1945, indicated to the United States and to the rest of the world that it was not particularly interested in going along with this kind of grand plan of collective security. The Soviet Union rejected membership in the Bretton Woods Agreement, which meant that it would stay out of the global capitalist system and remain autarkic. This was, as far as Roosevelt was concerned, a serious blow to this notion of an integrated global economy, which he thought was necessary if this collective security was to succeed. In 1944 and 1945, Stalin brutally imposed regimes in Eastern Europe that showed no even token of respect to the notion of self-determination, and indicated to the rest of the world that he still believed in cynical power politics. And most important of all, it was this question of the Security Council veto, which was sort of less dramatic in some ways, but probably more important in terms of our discussion, because Stalin insisted upon the veto. This is why Roosevelt gave into this, precisely because the Security Council in 1945 was composed of the Soviet Union, the United States, and three allies of the United States at the time, China, the United Kingdom, and France. And so Stalin quite naturally assumed that if there were no veto, these other four nations could team up against the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union would be legally unable to stop it. The problem with, of course, the veto, as we've already mentioned, is that with a Security Council veto, the permanent members of the United Nations Security Council are free to do whatever they want, as you talked about earlier, Trygve, without having to worry about any United Nations action, which basically puts to the lie to the whole notion of collective security. Right? I mean, if you're a small nation and the United States or Russia or whomever attacks you, what does this notion of collective security mean? It's a joke. And that is something that many people understood as soon as the veto was announced, including the realist scholar Hans Morgenthau. So this basically meant, as far as Roosevelt was concerned, Stalin's rejection of of integration in the global capitalist system, Stalin's continuing practice of power politics in Eastern Europe, and Stalin's rejection of a consensus of the Security Council and his insistence upon a veto. All of these things demonstrated to the rest of the world that if there was going to be some sort of international organization, it would not be participated in by the Soviet Union, which meant that you go back to the interwar period where you have an international organization that does not involve very powerful nations. And the Soviet Union was, by 1945, clearly the second most powerful nation on earth. And Stalin, for his part, was perfectly fine with this. Stalin believed in Marxist-Leninist doctrine, which said that as long as there is no global socialism, war is inevitable, and that the Soviet Union has to see to it that it's prepared for that war, as it was, and that's how we regarded the Second World War. And so this notion of transforming international power politics into some more liberal order of international organization and collective security, this is something that the United States and other nations perhaps wanted to see, but because the Soviet Union had no interest, this could not work. There was, however, one other possibility, and that was the possibility of using the novel threat of atomic war as a means of somehow getting the United States and the Soviet Union to agree on some sort of international accord whereby the two sides would recognize that the danger of a continuation of international anarchy in the atomic era was so intense that they could put aside these other differences and establish among the two superpowers some sort of global security agency that would get rid of the bomb or keep it at least under the control of this international agency. And this was something that was actually advocated by many Americans and others in the latter years of the war and in the first couple of years of the post-war era. The scientist Niels Bohr, Roosevelt's atomic advisors, James Conant, the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, made precisely this argument soon after the war came to an end. We may not like the Soviet Union, we may have an atomic monopoly now, but that monopoly is not going to last. And if we don't want a third world war waged with these kinds of weapons, we have to act, and we have to act radically, and we have to act now. And so leaving aside the problems of the veto, leaving aside the problems of global capitalism, this would be perhaps a means of establishing this kind of international security organization based simply on the long-term but looming threat of nuclear war. And so this was something that the United States ostensibly tried to pursue in late 1945 and 1946. When it proposed to the world a plan to establish international control over atomic energy, which would have, of course, include atomic weapons. This was the foundation of what's today the IAEA, and was driven by, at least ostensibly, this very idea that Stimson and others had argued, that you cannot continue to have international anarchy in a world in which the atomic bomb is there. So the United States, in the spring of 1946, under the new president, Harry Truman, proposed something called the Baruch Plan. And the Baruch Plan, which was a disingenuous plan, stated that the United States would not transfer any of its weapons or other atomic materials. And of course, at this time, the United States is the only country that had such materials and weapons, until all other nations, again, read the Soviet Union, had opened themselves to full inspection to make sure that they were not developing a bomb surreptitiously. And if these nations were caught trying to build a bomb surreptitiously, they would be subject to Security Council action, for which, in this instance, there would be no veto. So what is that telling Joseph Stalin? Stalin has an atomic project, which was moving into overdrive after Hiroshima. Stalin knows perfectly well that the Americans know that he has an atomic project because of the atomic espionage that had been going on since 1941. So Stalin is hearing a proposal from the United States, which says, we're going to inspect you. We know we're going to find weapons, and you're going to be subject to Security Council action, which can and would in this case mean war, for which you have no veto. What the United States was presenting to Stalin, and this is crucial in understanding any proposal for international organization on a serious level, is that were he to accept this plan, he would be accepting not an authentically international atomic energy organization, but one dominated by the United States. Who would be the one inspecting Soviet territory? It wouldn't be Portugal, it'd be the United States. Who would be the one nation enforcing the sanctions upon the Soviet Union, military sanctions? Again, it's not going to be Portugal, it's going to be the United States. What the Baruch Plan was essentially a proposal for a Pax Americana. And this is always the problem that emerges whenever you're wondering about serious international organizations. The question will always be asked, who runs these organizations? Who really holds the power? And the offer was on the table in 1946 for the United States to hold the power. And had Stalin accepted the Baruch Plan, that was what would have happened. But Stalin, of course, was never in a million years going to accept the Baruch Plan, and it went down to defeat in late 1946. So with the failure of the Baruch Plan in 1946, I argue in various writings that this essentially doomed the world to some kind of Cold War. Serious international organization was no longer possible. And this is due to the fact that the Soviet Union, once the Baruch Plan failed, and even before it failed, was dedicating all of its effort, Stalin called this national problem number one, to build nuclear weapons. Stalin knew that if the Soviet Union could not build nuclear weapons soon, the United States would come to dominate the world and the Soviet Union would be powerless to stop it. And if the Soviet Union was to survive and the communist dream was to live on, it was necessary to build atomic weapons. And this is what the Soviet Union subordinated all other purposes to that goal in the late 1940s, finally building a bomb in 1949. The Soviet Union wasn't going to do anything until it got a bomb. The United States already had the atomic bomb and certainly was not going to give them up now with the failure of the Baruch Plan. And so the world, by 1949 at least, was characterized by two very large powers, much more powerful than any other state, who were engaged in some sort of military competition. And this is exactly what Stimson had warned of back in 1945. He said, if you don't stop this, this is what's going to happen. And you're going to have a condition of international anarchy, as you did in the previous first half of the 20th century. And this led to two wars in the space of a generation. And we get to a third one with nuclear weapons. That could be the end of humanity. But Stalin chose to run that risk. The United States chose not to take the steps necessary to persuade him otherwise. And after 1946, I would say that the die was cast. The Cold War did not, of course, have to proceed exactly as it did, but there was going to be some sort of security competition between the two powers after this year. The remainder of the Cold War, therefore, had to deal with the fact that there was indeed a Cold War in which there could be no substantial international cooperation between the two largest powers. And so what do we see in terms of international organization during the rest of the Cold War? You see the establishment of a liberal order in the so-called First World, which in many ways was very successful on its own terms, but of course was fundamentally incomplete. And you see the emergence of first world institutions that do a pretty good job at some aspects of international organization, but do not deal with the problem of war and the problem of war avoidance. Apart from this, there is very little cooperation at all between the US and the Soviet Union during the rest of the Cold War, with one exception. And this is a very important exception, and that is the exception of the problem of nuclear war. The Soviet Union and the United States conclude successful arms control agreements. They tolerate the surveillance of one another's skies so that no one freaks out about you building more weapons. They establish communication between between Moscow and Washington after the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. And in a more general sense, after 1962 and the Cuban Missile Crisis, they tacitly agree to accept the condition of mutually assured destruction and avoid taking steps that could lead to a World War III. This is not done formally. It's not done through a formal organization for the most part, but it nevertheless represents a substantial form of international cooperation between the two nuclear superpowers. And why do they do this when they couldn't agree on anything back in 1945 and 1946? They do it because they recognize that if things go wrong in the nuclear age, this could lead to the extermination of both of their countries and perhaps the human race. This, in my judgment, is the only way that international organization, as Tiziana was saying at the end of her talk, is possible today, is for nations to recognize, as the US and the Soviet Union did during the Cold War, that existential threats, whether it be nuclear war or now as well, climate change, which was unknown back then as a problem, threaten the existence of humanity and therefore necessitate international cooperation where it has failed after the First World War and after the Second World War. As Tiziana said, there's no third time wrong. The logic had been, of course, among people like Stalin in 1945 and 1946, yeah, wars are terrible, but we just went through a terrible war and we survived it, and we can survive another one because there's no option to it. That's the way the world is. In a nuclear age, that's no longer a justifiable position to take. And it's no longer a justifiable position to take for any country. Otherwise, we're simply saying we're going to have a nuclear World War III, or we're going to have a climate crisis and the extinction of humanity. Too bad, there's nothing we can do about that. That strikes me as inadequate and also intellectually bankrupt. And on that note, I will stop.
Thank you very, very much. I've got, thank you both, Tiziana and Campbell, for really stimulating remarks. And again, for joining us. I have several questions, and I'm going to try to group them rather than ask each of them individually. And so to the audience, I will do my best to try to weave everyone's comments and questions in. I want to start, I mean, it seems like there are two things we've been doing here. One is to explore whether there may have been opportunities missed in the past that actually could have been seized, which I think was more the emphasis of my and Tiziana's talks. And one is, not that Campbell, you didn't emphasize this, but one is sort of, okay, even if some of these moves didn't work then, we are now in a position where we need to take them seriously. So I want to start kind of on the first point based on some comments coming in. And that's for Tiziana. Do you see, was there a chance to kind of lock in federalism in US policy? Perhaps before Stalin became quite so truculent, or not that he was ever a particularly non-truculent guy, but or at least lock in something like a majoritarian Security Council without a veto before this late 1944 or 1945 period that Campbell discussed. Oh, and could you put your microphone on, please?
I managed. Well, no, I do not think so. I do not think so, because by 1941, the analysis within the State Department and the groups that were advising Wilson was that the post-war order would be, let's call it dominated, whichever word you want to use, run, led by Great Britain and the United States. And that at that point was the position that settled. There were a lot of discussion before that, ahead of that, as to the merits of Spies plan. But it becomes obvious that once the United States understand that they can have a preponderance of power without any other measure, that is the preference that emerges. Against that, there was, I think, very little that could have been done. And so I think that there was at a certain point a decision that it could be done without such measures, that the preponderance of power was there, and that there was, at that point in time, that was the mindset. So in that regard, there was, I think, a total disregard of what was the actual preference of the American people and the majority, and what had been a long tradition in American history of engaging in the rest of the world without replicating the policies of power politics and all that. So I think that that was really a break in terms. So that's my answer to that.
Thanks for flagging me down. Campbell, regarding this one other possibility that you described, using the threat of atomic war to get the USSR and the United States to agree at least on some agency that was dominated by neither of them, at least to handle the nuclear problem. What exactly would that, what would a better Baruch Plan have looked like? I mean, for instance, I can imagine going that route on nuclear weapons and then just leaving the USSR out of the United Nations and forming a Security Council that didn't have a veto, or because we didn't have the excuse of the USSR anymore. But that's just, I'm just curious, what would a better approach have been to seize that moment, other than the obviously almost kind of insulting Baruch Plan?
Yeah, I mean, the problem with atomic weapons, and even more now today with nuclear weapons and missiles, is that an international agency that was dominated by neither state and could effectively make sure that no nation developed nuclear weapons would have to have enormous powers. Because inspecting a country, sanctioning a country that's trying to build nuclear weapons, preventing countries from doing so around the world, this is an enormous task. The problem with nuclear weapons, it's always been an enormous task, but the problem with nuclear weapons, and this is something that people in the US saw right away, is that you can't sort of be 95% good enough, right? If you're having a ban on certain kinds of ships, right? A nation might cheat and build one or two more than they're supposed to. That's not going to be a big problem for a nation. A nation that keeps a handful of nuclear weapons when they're supposed to have zero is such a massive problem that if you're going to develop an international agency to prevent that from happening, it basically has to be a world state. It basically has to have world government kind of powers, at least with respect to the problem of weapons. And so this would have required the United States to recognize this, and this is something that Stimson and Niels Bohr and others did recognize, and to make it happen, which would have required cutting a massive deal with the Soviet Union. Truman was reluctant to do this for many reasons, but a huge problem that he faced in 1946 is this is when news of the atomic spies came out. And there are already a lot of people critical of the Democratic Party at this time for having been infiltrated by communists. But now this is being announced with respect to atomic weapons, and that maybe these communists had, which they indeed had given secrets to the Soviet Union. So Truman was in a situation in 1946 where any kind of cooperation with the Soviet Union, especially with respect to atomic matters, was political suicide. But taking the steps to actually form a serious international organization in partnership with the Soviet Union, politically just almost impossible to imagine. So it would have been very, very difficult under any circumstances for the United States to do this. The politics of espionage in 1946 made it a completely off the table for Truman in that year. But to answer your question hypothetically, that's what you have to do. You have to have a powerful entity that can make sure that no nations can build or not rebuild nuclear weapons.
Thank you very much. A question actually going back to the World War I era and the World War II era about the reactions of other, a few questions about the reactions of the international community to the United States leaving or not failing to join the League of Nations. I hate to say rejecting the League of Nations because it was a minority of people who were responsible for it. But and the fact is that this sort of American Wilsonian vision of the League was not just an American phenomenon. It was very much, it wasn't necessarily what David Lloyd George or Georges Clemenceau wanted, but it was very much what a lot of the leading intellectuals and statesmen, and at that time they were primarily statesmen, did want. And in fact, those Europeans who were sort of found themselves tasked with largely constructing and manning the League of Nations recruited several Americans to place in leadership positions and had all sorts of informal but very influential networks that then were created between the League and U.S. policymakers. I mean, Raymond Fosdick is probably the most famous example of a person who was installed in a very high position at the League of Nations. There was also a lot of cooperation on non-security related things, about standardizing telecommunications and a world postal delivery, and there was lots of desire for the United States to take on a mandate, even though it had not even joined the League of Nations. So, so there was interest in continued. There was a very widespread sense among people all across the world that this failure of the United States to join was bad news. And in fact, another way that both Americans and Europeans sought to bring the United States into the League, sort of through the back door, was through the Permanent Court of International Justice, which, much like the League itself, I would argue, U.S. membership in that body enjoyed extraordinary public support year after year after year after year, and for largely domestic political reasons, never came about. So that's my best answer to this group of questions about international reaction. Another few questions about sort of exactly what a world federation would look like. So Campbell has told us that at the very least, it would have to have sort of absolute control over arms. And this is actually an idea that, spans way back to the 19th century, an international arms control union or disarmament union. But Tiziana, would this federation have worked through existing international institutions or supported them in some way? Would it have been its own kind of crusader? Would it serve as an example, kind of trying to deal with certain problems and questions and develop normative and possibly legal and practical precedents and models? Or would it be a full-fledged world state, the best, well, maybe not these days, the best parallel to which would be the United States?
There were several proposals, so it's hard to talk and generalize what it would have looked like. One thing that I think was common to all the proposals was what we call today the principle of subsidiarity, and therefore that in the areas where countries cannot really agree and eliminate disagreement without war, therefore those areas should be under the authority of a federation. And we do have this in the United States. It's also now in Europe, we have examples of what subsidiarity looks like. And so the idea would be that whatever cannot be done at the lower level of government should be done at the higher level of government in order to prevent war and in order to allow change by means other than war. In terms of historically, the idea in terms of, I'm looking, for example, crime strike, that was the main proposal. The proposal really was looked into more seriously because it was so specific. His idea was originated not to replace the legal nation, but to reinforce the legal nation. And this idea was that because there were certain countries that had preponderance of power, and their anarchy actually was the main cause of chaos in the world, and removing the anarchy from the relations of those countries, including the United States, Great Britain, and France, and then he extended to other countries for other reasons, because he didn't want to be just great powers, would have actually solved a lot of the problems of the League, and would have reinforced the League. And so his idea always remained that it was possible to have global cooperation, but that the option was not between federation and cooperation, but cooperation with federation and cooperation without federation. So that was a certain scheme that at a certain point was brought up. Other schemes were also brought up. I want to say something about the previous questions, just add one thing. The fact that at that point in time, federation was not a possibility does not mean that it's permanently an impossibility. And we have been formed, our mindset is that, well, because it failed at that point, and therefore what are the options that is not going to fail now? Many things have changed. And so that element framework of permanence is, I think, is really what is preventing us from moving to the next steps. And there are many reasons why that framework of permanence is not valid nowadays.
Thank you very much. I'm going to try not to respond too much because we have questions coming in. A couple of questions around, well, boy, it's too bad there were all these missed opportunities or ideas that flowered before their time. What, and you know, none of us are policymakers, but what, Tiziano or Campbell, what steps could be taken that are viable now to mitigate, let's say, the threat of nuclear war, mitigate the repetition, frankly, of what Russia's move into Ukraine? There's a comment about, are there sort of confidence building measures kind of along the lines of the International Space Station that could be kind of an opening wedge to cooperation? Basically, what, if any, international architecture is viable, and what would it take to get there?
Yeah, I'll have a stab at that. Well, I mean, I think there's two things that you could probably, that the United States could conceivably do. One is to change its nuclear policy, which right now is a policy of nuclear supremacy, and move to a no first use policy and a more defensive nuclear policy. This would not solve the problem, of course, but it would signal to the rest of the world that the United States is willing to sacrifice some measure of security advantage for the purposes of nuclear war avoidance. Another thing that's possible, and I would say if I were in charge of everything, I would say this is probably the best path to take, is to use the threat of environmental catastrophe as a means of developing this kind of international structure. Because I've already explained why it's very difficult to avoid nuclear war without building a very powerful world government. But the same cannot be said for an international organization that deals effectively with climate change. That doesn't run up against the problem of people having a few nuclear weapons in the basement. If you were able to develop a substantial international organization to deal with climate change, and this could be something that happens as a result of increasing numbers of natural disasters, then you would have established the architecture whereby eventually you would see the development of a governmental structure at the supranational level, which could also deal with nuclear weapons. So if I were hopeful, I would almost wish to see some sort of environmental catastrophe that would trigger this kind of action. I mean, this is the problem, and this goes all the way back to Thomas Hobbes, is that people tend to organize and act in their common interest only after disasters. Problem with climate change, as well, even more obviously of nuclear war, is that after that really happens, no one will be around to act. This is why there, as Tiziana said, there's no third chance.
Tiziana, how about you?
Yeah, I think that I concur with Campbell on that. Also, from my perspective, because I also focus so much on the idea of democracy, changing the foreign policy that democracies are now leading is a very important step in preventing things from going worse, which is in itself something we should not really take part in. I think that one thing that democracies can do, if they really want to walk the talk and claim that they are leading the world, is to change their own relations. Nobody can prevent them from doing that. No authoritarian regime can prevent them from doing that. So that would at least also set not only make them less weak in terms of attacks from authoritarian regimes, and we're seeing that these attacks are coming precisely on the grounds of international order and on international structures. We might dismiss the fact that a couple of days ago was the idea of the BRIC countries came and spoke about reforming the United Nations and making more, bringing new countries and making more just. And they are all in support of that. And nothing of that kind is coming from West. So that is one place where I think we are losing our focus on democracy. We're asked to uphold a system that is clearly not in the interest of the individual, that is asking the individual to support a system that cannot prevent that the life of the individual is not guaranteed under that system. Sorry, I'm getting a little bit confused thinking about other things. So changing the structures and the way that democracies relate to each other, and that would go a long way in also being able to implement some of the measures that they are claiming they can do in terms of climate change, because it would not be then bringing them back to their countries and having the laws not passed and all that. It would be a small step, but at least they will show some willingness to think that solving this crisis is more important than holding on to national sovereignty. And it will go a long way to prove also that they're sincere in that, and stopping policies like the Summit of Democracy that does not achieve anything, creates a lot of enemies, and is based on a system that is post-World War I in terms of the settings and the ideas and what it believes that democracy can do. So they're totally inadequate framework.
So there are things that a powerful state and nation culture like the United States can do that aren't sufficient, but are at least maybe necessary for any future opportunities for international organization. For instance, it's hard. It seems to me it would be hard if the United States and Britain and France and other leading democracies or aspiring democracies see an opportunity such as we're hoping for people to take them seriously if their own house is not in any kind of democratic order, either in their internal or relations or the way that they act toward other states. We have just about 10 minutes remaining. I wanted to ask, what is the extent, and Campbell, you've hinted at this, at least in terms of where nuclear weapons are involved. But, well, Tiziana, let me ask you, what was Clarence Streit's, let's say, just take one prominent figure's view on, exactly how much sovereignty needed to be relinquished and how much domestic jurisdiction needed to be maintained? I mean, John Foster Dulles is demonized by some for insisting on the domestic jurisdiction clause. You could also read his possibly as an effort to do kind of what I think you were describing, where there are certain problems that need to be handled at a national or a supranational level, and other problems that are better handled by the populations involved. What was the general kind of view among leading Federalists on just how much national sovereignty could be retained?
Well, at that point in time, the idea was common defense, that joint structures of common defense and monetary common structures. Citizenship was also part of the idea. And in general, the main areas that really are important where we should really have common joint structures are defense and the economy. And once those are in place, then other things can also be added to that, but those are the critical areas because they do eliminate power politics based on military supremacy or economic supremacy. And they also create more efficient societies that can reinforce democracy internally and in a sense also create a world that is less chaotic and therefore less competition and therefore less chance of authoritarian regimes emerging. That was the idea.
Having trouble unmuting myself. So the idea is that much like in the way we often think of the United States, there are certain massively important areas of cooperation that are critical, and then it's the task of the people involved to kind of figure out on a kind of case-by-case basis what else. That sets the pattern for cooperation and trust and a sense of kind of collective ownership of this project. And then you don't have to decide everything ahead of time.
Definitely. That was the idea that eventually that was, and even included the possibility of having socialist economy within such that was not precluded. If the people decide so, that's fine. So it was very open-ended, but it's the idea of being able to actually do together what we cannot do separately and avoiding war in that way. Great. And also change by having structures that do allow change.
Campbell, any final thoughts or anything you'd like to respond to? We have just a few more minutes.
I mean, yeah, the question you ask is obviously crucial because there's many obstacles indeed to this kind of world government organization. But one of them, of course, is the fact that people will worry that their ways of life or cultures will be oppressed or even eliminated by a overweening world government. And there's an interesting response to this by the international relations scholar Alexander Wendt, And he says that actually the formation of a world government is the surest way to protect local cultures, because a world government, like a government in a multinational, multicultural country, can actually codify and protect certain kinds of cultures. Whereas if the world continues as it is, not only is there a nuclear war and possible environmental catastrophe that make all these points silly, but also is the fact that as globalized capitalism becomes more pervasive, these cultures are going to be wiped out in any event. And of course, if you want to look at why Russia is doing what it's doing, this is in many ways how it's reacting to this. I mean, I'm not justifying it in any way. I think it's an atrocity, but this idea of globalized American-led capitalism, this is what countries like Russia don't want. And a world government that was effective could actually say, yeah, okay, Russia, you can maintain this kind of culture, and India, you can maintain this kind of culture, but you just can't have nuclear weapons. And that would be sort of the trade-off.
I would make that trade. I don't know about anyone else here. Well, thank you very much to both of you. We have just 5 minutes left, but I know that sometimes people schedule these things back to back to back. So I want to thank once again, Dr. Tiziana Stella and Dr. Campbell Craig for joining us. I want to thank our audience from all across the world, really, hundreds of you, for joining us as well. Thank you very, very much. Please continue to check the Wilson Center website for future installments of Wilson Then and Now. I want to thank the History and Public Policy program at the Wilson Center for their support. I want to thank Treyon Burgess, Tracy Fitzgerald, and Pete Bierstecker for their tech and logistical support. And again, many thanks to Tiziana Stella and Campbell Craig for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you, Trygve.